to. And part of the objective of this session is to try and raise more awareness about the mental health needs of refugees on the move, but to also call into question, I guess, how funding is allocated to support refugee coping while people are particularly in transit settings. Before I get into the detail of the report, though, my job is to set the scene a little bit in terms of how we got here. For those of you who don't know me, I have been working in the refugee sector for about 14 years now, in various senior management roles, both in the Australian resettlement sector and in the Asia Pacific region, and currently am the chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, and also still a board member of Host International, which was one of the partners that instigated this research. One of the things, also as a background, I am a social worker, and so I've always been interested in the idea of coping and mental well-being, and particularly working in the refugee space. I was particularly fascinated with how refugees in particular manage to process the trauma that they've experienced and yet still be able to make significant contributions to the communities where they worked. And I particularly was fascinated about the factors that contributed towards why some people managed to navigate those challenges perhaps more easily than others might appear to. But my work initially was in the resettlement space in Australia, and that's where I first met Dr. Angela Nickerson, and we worked together on some research projects, particularly around the big influx of asylum seekers into Australia and the boat arrivals and some of the difficult policies that were implemented by the Australian government. And we particularly started looking there at how asylum seekers were coping in that context, particularly around the insecure visa status and the deliberate insecureness of bridging visas at the time. My work then evolved into working in the Asia Pacific context. And again, I particularly noticed that people in transit were going through some significant challenges. And so it became quite a concern to me that most of the world's refugees were in these transit countries, like in Indonesia. Yet a lot of the focus was in the resettlement context. And people in these transit contexts were living without any visa security, without any day-to-day subsistence or support. And yet some people in those contexts were seemingly coping remarkably well psychologically. And I say that with some caveat because I think all refugees do struggle in that context, but some people seem to be managing in that context better than other people. And so long story short, a conversation took place with Angela where we decided to put together an application for an Australian Research Council grant, and were successful in securing a grant to undertake some research, which ultimately ended up in this Pathways to Refugee Wellbeing. So the objective of the research, and Angela will talk to this in more detail, was essentially to try and understand the factors that contributed towards people coping better or worse in a transit context in particular. At the time, we realised that there was very limited research on refugees in transitory contexts, and particularly for refugees living in urban settings rather than refugee camps. We were also struck by what seemed to be an effort to engage, particularly in Indonesia, pro bono clinicians to provide mental health supports, but there being way more demand than there was capacity within the pro bono sector. And so the objectives of the research were not only just to understand refugee coping and wellbeing, but to also inform programming that would ideally provide access to lower cost interventions that would support mental health outcomes for refugees in urban transit settings. And particularly we were interested in, and have gone on to further test this, the idea of peer support or peer-led support mechanisms that would support people within their communities. So ultimately, the research is aiming to better understand the way that refugees experience mental health, but also to explore factors that are both environmental and psychological that either lead to positive or worse mental health. So what we're hoping today you'll get an overview of is what we found from that and some of the recommendations that we have for how that can be done better. And what we're hoping for is that in the discussion with the panel, we will be able to explore some of the practical challenges and brainstorm ideas for how this research can inform the future programming of supports to refugees in transit settings. So on that note, I will introduce Dr. Angela Nickerson to tell us more about the research itself. So for those of you who don't know Angela, she's a professor of the School of Psychology at University of New South Wales in Sydney, and she is also the director of the Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program, which sits within that school. She is a clinical psychologist with 2 decades of experience in working with refugee and post-conflict communities internationally. And Angela has published more than 150 journal articles, books, and book chapters on refugee mental health. Her work focuses on increasing our understanding of factors that influence refugee wellbeing, with the goal of informing policies and practices that support refugees to thrive in their new homes. That is a fairly humble way of saying that she's an expert in refugee trauma and interventions. And Angela has been a pleasure to work with on this project. And she's going to tell us about the research and the findings now. So over to you, Angela.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for that very lovely introduction as well. I'll just share my screen. So I've got some slides to go through some of the findings here. So it really has been an absolute pleasure and an honour to work on this project with our various collaborative organisations, and I'm really delighted to share with you some of the findings from this project, which has been 6 years in the making with you today. So as David mentioned, when we started this project, we were really eager to identify pathways. We wanted to understand what were the factors that drive coping for refugees living in these contexts of really long-term displacement and uncertainty. And to do this, we implemented a research study. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of which areas the study focused on and the methodology, and then take you through some of the findings and recommendations. So in this study, we were really keen to make sure that we understood a number of the key drivers of refugee wellbeing. And so we collected data on demographics, so we'd understand who was participating in the study. We also wanted to understand the impact of past experiences and current stresses. So we know that many people from refugee backgrounds, of course, are exposed to trauma in their home countries, but also that many of the ongoing stresses in the post-displacement environment are really salient as well. So we wanted to capture those. We also wanted to understand the psychological consequences of these experiences. Not surprisingly, when people go through this level of adversity, we often see heightened psychological symptoms, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and so on. So we wanted to understand what was contributing to these. We wanted to understand social factors, so things like the extent to which people felt they belonged in the community in Indonesia and had also strong links within their own community. And finally, we were really interested in identifying what kinds of coping strategies were helpful and what kinds of coping strategies were not helpful, to really give us concrete information about how best to cope in these very difficult circumstances. So to take you through how this study really evolved, we started with a period of stakeholder engagement in Indonesia, where we did face-to-face meetings with refugee-led organisations, community-based organisations, and NGOs to really understand the perspectives of community members in terms of what we needed to be measuring. We then undertook a number of surveys. So participants in this study completed 4 surveys over 4 time points, 6 months apart. And as part of this, in addition to completing surveys, our participants really joined a research community. And this was something that was very important to us, that when participants were taking part in this study, they were getting regular updates on the findings and how the study was going. But also this study took part during COVID-19, and it was a time of significant stress for many of our participants in this study. And so we felt that it was also important to set up some wellbeing workshops where we could give people sort of practical skills and tools And this was really something that we did in conjunction with our partners, many of whom are here today. We've got David, of course, from Host International. We've also got SUAKA, who was an integral part of this study, UGM as well. Randy, I don't know if you're here today, but so we really brought together expertise from a variety of different areas to try to support the community during this time. And finally, we undertook some focus groups to really do a bit more of a deep dive into the findings and help us contextualize the participants' individual experiences to help us understand what the numbers meant. So overall, we had just over 1,200 adult refugees and asylum seekers take part in this study, and they completed an online survey at 4 time points in Arabic, Farsi, Dari, Somali, or English. You can see here on the right the progression through the study and that we ended up with an ultimate retention rate at time 4 of 61%, which is really great for a study like this, and I think really spoke to our participants' engagement with and commitment to the study. Recruitment was done via refugee-led organisations, community-based organisations, and social media. This recruitment strategy shifted during the period of the project as we were able to do face-to-face meetings at the very beginning before COVID-19, and then after shutdown really had to move to an online recruitment strategy. And participants who took part in the study received a 100,000 Indonesian rupiah shopping voucher as a reimbursement at each time point they were involved. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of who the participants were, who took part in the study, we saw about 1/3 of our participants being from Afghanistan, about 1/5 from Iraq, and 15% from Somalia, with the remainder being from a variety of different countries. We had around about 3/4 of our participants being male, a variety of educational levels, and 3/4 of our sample being under 35. And you can see these participant characteristics here really map broadly onto what we know about the characteristics of people from refugee backgrounds living in Indonesia based on UNHCR data. So we can feel fairly confident that we were able to capture a diversity of perspectives that were representative of our refugees living in Indonesia. You can see here some of the experiences of our participants. We had half of our sample who did not have any immediate family in Indonesia. About 90% were registered with UNHCR. And you can see here that many people had been granted refugee status. A smaller amount were pending, and 3% had not been granted refugee status. So one thing that we were really eager to do was to understand what were the things that people were encountering in their daily lives that were really causing the most stress in the Indonesian context. And we found that there were many, not surprisingly, given the context that David's laid out. So we found that participants were particularly troubled by difficulties finding or being able to work, which is related to work right restrictions for refugees in Indonesia, but being worried that their visa status will never be resolved, not having enough money to meet daily needs, not being able to undertake study, and also being fearful of being sent back to their country of origin. In terms of psychological distress, we can see here that around 1 in 2 people suffered from elevated levels of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, depression, and psychological disability. And as I mentioned before, these rates would be what we would expect for people who are living under very difficult circumstances after having experienced traumatic events in their home country. So now I'm going to take you through some of the key themes that really emerged from these findings. We wanted to understand what the data was telling us about the experience for people from refugee backgrounds living in Indonesia. And really it was these 4 areas that really came together when we looked at the data in more depth. So in terms of social inclusion is the first area that we focused on. And what we saw was that the findings showed us that social factors like the availability of family support, engagement with the host community, and discrimination had an impact on mental health and coping. And we've just got some quotes from some of our participants in the focus groups to illustrate what this meant to people. So this person's talking about being a refugee, which is just a name, and that really, first and foremost, people are human and need to see each other as human, not as a refugee or as other countries or other regions, which I think speaks to the importance of discrimination, which is something that we found was a really key driver of wellbeing in this study. So some of our key findings in relation to social inclusion were that we found that lack of social connection, particular isolation and loneliness were associated with double the risk of depression, anxiety, and poor general health. We found that discrimination was associated with worsened depression symptoms over time, that engagement with refugee-led organisations contributed to greater well-being and coping ability. The proficiency in Bahasa Indonesia fostered community belonging and greater social engagement. And also that social connection, being defined as positive support within one's own community, but also connection to the broader Indonesian community, contribute to better mental health over time, but also vice versa. So people who were coping better, who had a better sense of well-being, were more likely to connect with others. And I think all of these things taken together really point to the importance of this social inclusion and the broader environment that people were finding themselves in terms of fostering well-being and providing opportunities for connection and meaning around that. So on the basis of this, we developed some key recommendations in relation to social inclusion. The first of these was noting that offering social connection programs that bring together both refugee and host communities is an important step for fostering social inclusion, and in particular, community awareness initiatives that really target some of the discrimination patterns that we saw and recognize the impact this have on wellbeing is a really important step that needs to be taken. We also saw that really familiarity and competence in the local language in Bahasa Indonesia was an important facilitator of social connection. And so social inclusion can be enhanced by providing opportunities for refugees to learn the language. Really importantly, we saw that engagement in refugee-led or community-based organisations was associated with better well-being. And this may be because it's providing a sense of community, providing a sense of purpose where people can support one another in very difficult circumstances. And so one of our recommendations is that these refugee-led initiatives be resourced appropriately to really foster this social inclusion. And finally, to support and mobilise local governments to facilitate social inclusion. And this is really also recognising that around Indonesia, local governments take very different approaches to policies in relation to refugees, and that it's important to document things that are being done well, as well as things that aren't going so well, so that we can really work at a broader level to ensure that the positive policies are being implemented. So the next theme that really emerged from the data related to economic inclusion. And here we found that access to sustainable income plays a critical role in day-to-day quality of life for refugees in Indonesia and can impact on well-being. One of our participants noted that it was a crisis situation, that people really were not having enough money to meet their basic needs, and this was causing a great deal of suffering. But also noting the strengths and skills that are embedded within refugee communities, and that many refugees had the skills and the education that would facilitate them being able to work and contribute to economic outcomes within the broader society, but these opportunities were not there. So in terms of our key findings related to economic inclusion, we found that only 19% of males and 13% of females earned any income, often through informal means or NGO assistance. This really is a reflection of the lack of work rights for refugees in Indonesia. We also saw that some people were more vulnerable to poor economic outcomes and saw more barriers to earning income. And this included females, people in independent rather than IOM housing, and those from Arabic, Farsi or Somali-speaking backgrounds. We saw that access to education was limited, especially for those with low Bahasa proficiency or lower educational backgrounds, and that economic hardship was linked to legal issues, communication difficulties, and social isolation. But overall, I think a really important finding was that financial stability was associated with improved mental health over time, which of course makes sense that if we don't have that basic ability to meet our needs and the financial means to do so, that it's very difficult to thrive in an environment. And so this led us to make some recommendations, the first of which was to remove barriers to economic inclusions, in particular, for example, preventing refugees from opening bank accounts. And this includes removing barriers around identifications. So, for example, issuing refugees with identification that will allow them to open bank accounts or allowing UNHCR identification to be valid as a pathway to do so. We also saw that a recommendation is facilitating meaningful economic participation in the host society, removing some of these barriers to people being able to engage in this way. And this really speaks to the issue of work rights in terms of allowing people the opportunity to earn money and to engage in that way. And finally, removing barriers to accessing ongoing education, and in particular, making sure that education that can be accessed is able to be certified and, even internationally recognized to provide people with a pathway of accessing further education and using these skills in the next step on the migration journey. So the next theme that we really dove into was around well-being. And what we found here was that really the external situation for many refugees who are living in Indonesia in prolonged displacement meant that there were significant stresses, legal, financial, and social stresses, and that these stresses were associated with increased psychological distress. This was then also really exacerbated by limited access to quality mental health care, greater social isolation, persistent boredom, and loneliness. And, again, our participant talking about how there are so many stresses and that people feeling that they're not cared about or they've been left behind. So in terms of our key findings, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, 1 in 2 participants were experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, along with functional impairments. That higher psychological distress was linked to a greater use of negative coping strategies. And these are things like avoiding your feelings, but also thinking about negative situations in the past and the present over and over again, as well as challenges in managing uncertainty. We did see that positive coping strategies were linked to better mental health, and these were things like feeling confident that you could affect the impact on the environment around you, ability to manage your emotions, and also ability to change tactics when situation needs change, so flexibility. Now, all of these were linked to better mental health, but we did see that they were most effective under relatively low stress conditions. When people were experiencing very high stress conditions, these strategies were less effective. And so these findings really led us to recommend, first of all, the provision of evidence-based programs to support the mental health of people from refugee backgrounds, but also designing programs recognizing that really these external factors, these daily stresses, this lack of access to rights and opportunities and resources are really driving mental health. So alongside teaching personal coping skills, we want to be looking at programs and policies that support the minimization of these daily stresses. Increasing access to specialized services for refugees with complex mental health needs is an important pathway. And finally, providing access to basic services and activities to overcome some of these barriers to wellbeing, and particularly working within refugee communities, for example, refugee-led or community-based organizations, to work out mental health support strategies that are really designed for and fit the community needs. So the final theme I want to talk about today is one of the most important, which is around pathways to future certainty. What we saw here over and over again was that people from refugee backgrounds cope better when information about their current and future options are transparent and provide confidence in what will happen to them in the future. We had our refugee participant talking about how refugees have no right to access information about asylum seeking process or resettlement, and that leaves people feeling confused, puts people under pressure and stress, and this has even led to people losing their lives because of this situation. So some of our key findings around pathways to future certainty included that persistent uncertainty and insecurity adversely impacted mental health and well-being, that long waiting periods with limited information and transparency about the RSD process without essential services worsened living conditions, and that additional crises such as COVID-19 exacerbated these difficulties. Finally, we saw, importantly, that participants who were further along the RSD process, who had more certainty about what was going to happen in their future, reported better mental health outcomes. And these led us to make some key recommendations around providing clear, timely, and reliable information about available RSD process, including evaluation criteria, requirements, and timelines, to increase speed and transparency in the RSD process, and also to have greater transparency from institutions involved in this process regarding their limitations in facilitating solutions to refugee needs. So that was a little bit of a snapshot of the findings. And of course, there are many more findings throughout this study that we would be very eager to share with people. And I just wanted to point out that these 4 themes really came to the forefront as things that are absolutely critically important to be addressed and considered from a policy level and a practice level. And I think I speak on behalf of all of the people involved in the project to say that these findings, we don't want them to sit in a report. What we want to see them do is to go out and to actually be used in a way that's useful and meaningful to advocate for changes in these contexts. So please do reach out to us if you have any suggestions or would like any support in doing that. And I'd just like to note that the report has now been published on our website at the Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program at UNSW. We have this report available in full in English and Bahasa Indonesia, with executive summaries also in Arabic, Farsi, and Somali. And we also have fact sheets with some of the key findings or recommendations in all of the study languages, as well as Bahasa Indonesia. We'd be delighted to share those with you. Just to note that, of course, there are many, many people who were involved in this study that we would like to acknowledge. Of course, our partners, Host International, UGM, and SUAKA, the many people involved in the project design and implementation and the preparation of the report. But very importantly, we want to take the opportunity to thank the refugee community leaders, interpreters, organisations and services in Indonesia for advising on all aspects of the study and assisting us in all parts of the process. But very importantly, we want to wholeheartedly thank every refugee community member who placed their trust in us to really share their experiences and help us understand better the impact of this situation and how to foster wellbeing in these contexts. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now and hand back to David.
Thank you, Angela. I just want to reiterate what Angela has said, that this wouldn't have been possible without the partnerships with both the community and with others that have been involved over the years. There's been lots of different people. Some of you are in the call today, and we appreciate the contributions that everyone has made. I do also want to point out that there was a huge amount of data that we've collected as part of this, and the refugee community in Indonesia were very generous, as Angela said, in sharing their information, and have called upon us to share this with yourselves and with anyone who will listen, to ensure that refugees who are remaining in Indonesia are not forgotten and that their situation is understood. That in collecting, what we aim to do is collect a whole range of data, not just on mental health, but also on social experiences, day-to-day stresses, those sorts of things. And so whilst we have published a number of academic papers to disseminate some of the findings, and this report does outline many of those academic papers, but also in addition other findings that we've had, there is still a lot more that we could discover from the data. And so we are very much interested out of today to invite you to reach out to us if there are things you would like to know, because it's very possible that we have data that could speak to that. And we'll hopefully unpack that as we go through the session today. But essentially, this report is designed to be an accessible version of the information, and along with the fact sheets, to allow you to digest that information and ideally share it with other people, and particularly decision makers in Indonesia and beyond. We're going to move on to our next speaker. I would encourage you, if you have questions, to capture them. You can start to put them in the chat if you like, and we'll get to them when we have our discussion. I just want to pick up on the point, though, that partnerships were critical for us being able to implement this project, and particularly our local partners in Indonesia, being UGM and SUAKA. Many of you will know SUAKA as trusted and well-respected refugee legal support and advocacy organisation in Indonesia. And SUAKA have been fundamental, along with UGM, in helping us to build confidence within the community for this project to achieve a high retention rate and to ensure that that everybody is across what the day-to-day challenges are in Indonesia. And so I'm going to introduce Atika from SUAKA to speak to us a bit more about the Indonesian context and the relevance of this research to Indonesia. A little bit about Atika. She's currently the chairperson of SUAKA in Indonesia and also a lawyer. She has been involved in work related to refugees since 2011, serving as a legal advisor and co-founder of SUAKA. She's engaged in work at SUAKA, such as providing legal advice and assistance, engaging in advocacy and networking, and planning the organisation's work agenda. She's also involved in consultation and legal aid related to refugee status determination and domestic law for refugees. She has also worked at the Jakarta Legal Aid Institute, Aros Palangi, if I'm pronouncing it right, and a law firm, and she has gained experience in providing legal aid and advocacy since. And many of you may not realise that SUAKA is probably, I think, the only legal aid support service available for refugees in Indonesia, and therefore provides a very important role. So over to you, Atika, to tell us about the significance of this in the Indonesian context.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm really glad and finally launch this report for SUAKA. This is the result of almost 7 years of collaborative work, and today is a very emotional moment for me after listening refugees' stories, working with this amazing team, and now sharing our finding with all of you. And basically, we are not a psychology expert. Like David said, that we work is legal aid, legal empowerment, advocacy, campaign, and research. But through years of engagement with refugees, communities, NGO, and other stakeholders, we have seen firsthand how mental health is deeply connected to refugees' daily lives. So currently, more than 12,000 refugees remain stranded or live in Indonesia, and many of them have been waiting 7 to until 10 years without any certainty about their future. And this is prolonged waiting has a huge psychological impact that on the report, imagine living every day with no clear future, only survival and hope. The two words refugee used most often to describe their lives, and the correlation between the refugees' mental health and their daily life is clear amidst their limitation in accessing basic rights. The refugee experience are restricted access to education, allowed to attend schools, but without the right to obtain diplomas. They cannot work legally and risk detention if they try to earn a living. So they depend on limited financial aid. And unlike the Indonesian citizen who have we know BPJS or National Health Insurance, refugees have almost no access to healthcare, especially mental health care. And now refugees are often stigmatized as a burden. In reality, if we given the chance, they could contribute so much to society. And my experience, one of the refugees told that every day I woke up not knowing what will happen, but I must keep going for my children. That is one of the statements that impact me. And so it is related to the report. It's not just about the number of policies, it is about the people. And how refugees survive, stay strong, amid the limitation and manage to keep hope alive. We believe this research can be the basis for policymakers and stakeholders to finally pay attention to the mental health of refugees and to recognize their voices also. And we think that why it is matters for policy and practice. We think that this research can inform evidence-based policy making by showing that mental health is not only an individual issues, but also a social and structural challenge linked to low economy and inclusion based on this research. And it pushes stakeholders to see refugees not just a temporary guest or transit in Indonesia, but as human beings with rights, needs, and potential contributions. And by addressing barriers and leveraging opportunities, Indonesia can improve refugee well-being while also strengthening local community. And echoing the aims say before that almost the recommendation in that report is full, and I just echoing those points, but in more detail. Like our recommendation is integrated refugees in community health, education, and vocational programs. Issue circulars to accept UNHCR ID for basic service like a banking, health insurance, and etc. Support local governments, or we call PEMDA, to integrate refugees in community health, education, and vocational program. Expand community-based psychosocial support, like a training para counselor from refugee communities, and increase transparency in resettlement prospects so refugee can manage expectation and mental health, and partnership to create safe internship or apprenticeship opportunities. Reducing stigma is our urgent step we can take, minimum. And it is more important, like inviting RLO to collaborate and play an active role in representing the community. And we hope that the other studies or research can cover a wider range of the refugee. And that is, I think, from my side and perspective, David. So back to you, and we can discuss after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Atika. So as Atika was saying, the struggles of the refugees face day-to-day in Indonesia are significant and not that uncommon to how urban refugees in other contexts also experience hardship. I think in particular, Indonesia, we do find that there are some particular challenges with the lack of legal status, the lack of work rights, the lack of basic services available to refugees, and a limited NGO sector and very limited funding for that sector. But of course, many of you understand that that's a common story, and funding is becoming tighter and tighter. So on that note, we have also invited Hafsa, who is one of the co-secretary generals of APRIN, to help us to think about the regional context. When we did this research, we certainly didn't have the intention that it would only be of benefit to Indonesia. We wanted it to have wider reaching application, and certainly in my experience, I've seen similar issues and challenges in other contexts. And so we've invited Hafsa to talk to how this report might be used and might be relevant at a regional level, and how we can perhaps get mental health on the agenda in an environment that is increasingly political and limited resources. But a little bit about Hafsa to start with. Many of you will know Hafsa, but Hafsa is the Co-Secretary General of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, as I said, and before that was also the chair of the network. Hafsa is a social worker, human rights defender, and a Rohingya activist, with lived experience. They advocate for the rights of refugees, LGBTIQ+ communities, statelessness, gender equality, prevention and responses to SGBV, and ending child marriages. And Hafsa has more than 15 years of experience working with refugee communities, INGOs, NGOs, and served as an interim advisory member of the UNHCR advisory group. Their expertise includes understanding the ground realities of challenges faced by refugees, statelessness, and LGBTIQ+ communities. As someone with lived experience, they are a passionate advocate for the power shift, inclusion, and diversity within the systems. Their work and advocacy are centred on improved prevention and response measures to SGBV to promote and protect the rights of refugees, stateless people, asylum seekers, and LGBTIQ+ communities in the Asia Pacific region and beyond. So welcome Hafsa, who is also coming to us from New York, who's there for the UN meetings. So we appreciate her making the time at a very not so good hour of the night. But thank you, Hafsa, for joining us, and over to you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, if I'm a little bit in a sleepy mode and wandering around from different topics, bring me back to the agenda. Yeah, I thought I will just come with the bit of regional displacement figure now. The report on there was a release on the 6th of August 2025 is saying by UNHCR is saying that now we have people of concern in the region in Asia and Pacific 7.3 million. 47% of children and 7.2 million are refugees. So just to remind ourselves a bit of our geographic figure as in refugees and forced displacement. As you all know, in 2025, there was a funding cut. So now we are looking at only 30% of UNHCR financial needs has been met in the region this year. So this number, they are not just the number. These reflect the millions of refugees and displaced population living in the region and the hardship that they experience in terms of having the very necessary services, including mental health services. So many have to close down. That includes also organizations that provide mental health services. So as the David and others, the previous speaker has mentioned, although it has been covered only for the Indonesia context, from my perspective, is a lot of challenges in the region in Asia and Pacific are similar under the diverse protection and survival challenges in different country contexts, ranging from livelihood challenges to deportation, non-refoulement, etc. That includes countries like Thailand, India, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, and so forth. So a couple of key challenges for the refugees that we have noted are, as also the previous researcher has mentioned, forgive me, I can't recall your name now, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in my time here. Different phases of trauma that people will experience in their life. First, starting from the country of origin, like people like me, in the country of origin from day one, you have to go through all this operation in your life. It's not just one-time incident. It's like in your everyday reality. And then when refugees make the decision of leaving or they are compelled to leave the country, have to then go through all this very stressful, unsafe journey coming to a country wherever they make to their final destination. So there was a different phases of trauma that we have to go through. Upon that, if they finally make it to a country like Indonesia, India, Thailand, Pakistan, and all these countries, then there is another challenge and trauma await, as Atika has explained, and all that different limitation to having the very basic decent human life. So a couple of challenges and that we have also identified in APEN network together with the members and others work is detention and lack of documentation, because most of the countries in the region, they don't have refugee policy, as you are all aware. Because there is no refugee policy and refugees are always at risk of detention. And when refugees are detained in countries like India, because it is very sensitive even to touch on that topic, it is untold story. People then experience unspoken human rights violations in the detention and etc. And in some countries like Malaysia, even people sleep at night, they're not sleeping in peace. They don't know when this operation immigration raids happen in the middle of the night and breaking in their door and taken away to the detention. And on top of that, there was the escalation of human rights violation from detention to deportation. Like some people are being forcibly deported to the countries where another nightmare awaits for them. That can be risks to their life and stuff. So also, as previous speaker has mentioned, there is access to education being denied. People do not have education, healthcare, and livelihood, and all that. And another thing is that people from the countries like Myanmar, who are still having, like also Afghanistan, who are still having this intensified civil war inside, a political instability, are still compelled to leave the country. When they leave the country, people are also forced to take this dangerous boat journey, including from Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. So it means the journey itself is very traumatizing under the human trafficking, smuggling, and then the prolonged journey on the boat. There was a lot of assault, and people go through during this months-long journey. And these are also another additional mental health distress that are added additionally. And the maritime movement. If people finally then make it without dying in those difficult trafficking route on land or BRC, if they finally make it to any countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and all this India, what a wait is, okay, welcome, you did not die, come, put it in the handcuff and put it in the detention. So all this layer of stress that refugees and displaced community have to go through, they never had a chance to learn it and sit with the pain and trauma that they have experienced. They just have to go on the survival mode. That then caused so many damages to the lives of the people and to their family and to their ability to make the decision that concern their life. And then going back to the limitation to getting these mental health services for refugees and asylum seekers in the countries of origin and in host countries, after this funding cut, the organizations that have been completely cut off from fundings, the top ones are also the ones that provide mental health. For example, in Malaysia, the organization that provide mental health is completely gone. There was no money to fund them because even for other really pressing matter like protection challenges, the organizations that are providing protection challenges are barely trying to survive, and so many restructuring, as you may have all seen. And also the latest the decision that has been made by the US government that has been announced that the resettlement cutting off, it's also adding another stress layer to the people, because even if resettlement is less than 1%, including myself, when I was a refugee in Malaysia, this is one little hope that we all hold on to, knowing that that one hope is also gone from the agenda, is also adding another layer of stress. And also the researcher has mentioned previously, Atika has mentioned, is that when people know there is no future await for you upon leaving from your country, when you're waiting in the host country, you have no future as in wherever you are, no work right, no protection, and no resettlement. And also looking at the repatriation, both for Afghanistan and Myanmar. The fact that I'm mentioning these two countries is because these are the two largest displaced population from this country in our region. Of course, there are other from Libya and Iran, Yemen, and etc. But knowing that repatriation is not going to happen, knowing that there is no resettlement option, there were very limited and complementary pathway, labor mobility, and all that, there was no hope. It's also adding so many mental health distress and challenges to the refugees and asylum seekers. The damages that caused, you have seen and also mentioned in the research, is that it can be to the extreme, as if to the extent that people committing suicide. If it's not, including myself, I suffered from depression when I was in Malaysia, knowing that, oh, what's going to happen to my life? And I'm still on medication. I'm not ashamed of saying that. And I have been resettled to New Zealand now 6 years. I'm in a lot more privileged position. If I'm going through this, can you imagine how other refugees who are still in the refugee camps and in limbo are going through, and what level of mental health challenges they are going through? In terms of what this research, talk about the challenges could mean in terms of advocacy, is that this can be an evidence in the regional advocacy. This can be the advocacy tools that we can promote the advocacy to the state donors and allies in terms of prevention for detention, deportation and non-refoulement, etc. Also advocacy for the denial of work rights, because mental health is also directly connected to the work rights and not having access to education, etc. And one other advocacy that we could do in the global advocacy that we see through our network perspective is that that we can always we can and we have to always highlight is that Asia and Pacific region is the region that one of the regions that hosts the largest protracted displacement in the world, and integrating this finding into the global forum like Global Refugee Forum, UNGA, GCM Review could be something worth doing, and we must do that to ensure the region's realities are not sidelined and is back on the agenda. The role of APRAN is, again, what we could do with this report. There could be an added value to the work that we do into turning this into a data so we can then coordinate in our advocacy together with our member, particularly supporting refugee-led organizations and to amplify their voices and ensuring that mental health is not treated as a secondary. Only if we have other priorities, we will look at mental health. That cannot happen. It has to be a simultaneous thing. So it has to be a protection critical. I will stop it here and I'll answer any other questions.
Thank you, Hafsa. Certainly, there are many issues that cut across into other contexts. And as you say, one of the hopes for this research is that it doesn't just stay on the paper, but that it does help in putting forward and advocating and providing evidence for the needs of refugees in Indonesia, but also refugees in other similar contexts in other locations. And so one of the things we're hoping to do after this launch today is to also run some subsequent webinars on each of the themes in a bit more detail, but to also engage with stakeholders across the region with the support of APRAN to raise awareness about this issue and some of the strategies that are raised in the report to try and address it. But again, I'll reiterate that there is so much more that we could talk about that we couldn't include in the report, or it would be too long. And so, I think one of the things we're interested in hearing from you is if there are things that you would like to know more about. What we want to do, though, is move into a bit of a discussion about some of the aspects of the findings in a bit more detail, but this is also your chance to ask some questions. I see that there are some questions in the chat already, and I encourage you to put more questions into the chat as they come to mind. There is one question in the chat that I might start with, and these questions are to anyone in the panel who wants to answer. But if I understand it correctly, there's a question there around, there's obviously a lot of intersecting issues that refugees face in a country like Indonesia. One of them is the fact that they don't have an enduring legal status, and so can be theoretically returned to their country of origin at any time by Indonesia. But recognizing that refugees, in becoming refugees, experience some level of trauma, and that trauma contributes towards mental health. I'm wondering whether the panel could comment on, from the research findings and your participation in regional advocacy, what would you say would be some of the most important aspects that could be adjusted in terms of refugee programming for refugees in Indonesia that might improve mental health outcomes, if you could identify one or two things that you think would have the greatest impact? And I might start with Angela, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. I think it's a big question, and it's a tricky question. I mean, I think that what really came out from the research study was that the external circumstances that refugees living in Indonesia are finding themselves in are really, really tough. So we can see this lack of rights, lack of access to services, but also just this incredible uncertainty. And what we know from a large body of literature with a variety of different populations who've been exposed to traumatic events, adversity, is that the thing that's most helpful in people recovering and adapting and thriving is safety and security and predictability. And this really reflected, I think, what we saw in this study was that many people felt that these conditions weren't there and didn't experience that safety. They weren't sure what was going to happen. There wasn't transparency about information. And so I think a really important take home from this research, which speaks to the questions about protection that are in the chat, is fostering that environment where people have information, they know what's happening, they know what the process is, as a way of really, I guess, reducing that sense of uncertainty. And alongside that, I think reducing these external barriers to people being able to really adapt and adjust and cope.
Okay. Atika, did you have a comment on that question?
Yeah, especially from Marwa, it is like you said, it's like a tricky. But if I had to pick one root contributing factor, and it is about the lack of legal recognition and rights for refugees in Indonesia. It is yes, that is broad, but why? Because legal limbo prevents refugees from working legally, accessing education, certification, or enrolling in health insurance. It is and this single barrier then cascades into economic hardship, social exclusion, and poor mental health. And without recognition, refugees are treated as, like I said before, like guests with no long-term plan, which foster a stigmas and fuels uncertainty about their futures. And such as recognizing UNHCR cards for services or creating pilot schemes for work and education, Indonesia, I think, could trigger a ripple effect from that, like more stability, improve mental health, stronger like a stronger community relation, reduce stigma, and the others. I think that is from me, David. Back to you. Thank you.
And Hafsa, do you have a comment from your experience?
Yeah, I just want to comment on before you could was comment on it will be very important also to start building the culture of talking about mental health, because in many cultural perspective, mental health is not something that people want to talk about. It is taboo. We don't want to, it's a shame, to talk about mental health. And the other thing is when mental health challenges, when refugees go through, it comes to the severe extent is that you're doing the meditation and journaling doesn't help. It needs the medication. So it will be so important to advocate to make it accessible and possible for the refugee communities to have the basic and essential medicine to maintain and calm their mental health condition. And thirdly, is also doing some awareness session about when the situation doesn't improve overnight, in a very short term, trying to learn to live in that and holding on to hope will be also essential. Over.
Oh. I might go to Mustafa. You've got your hand up. Please go ahead, ask a question.
Thank you, David. I would say thank you very much, Angela, Atika, for excellent presentation. I was very keen to listen to the findings because I lived as a refugee in Indonesia for 2 years, but now I'm here in Australia since past many years. And our organization support refugee-led organizations, community-led organizations in Indonesia. And I'm so happy that you all completed this report and I get to hear. So I have a few questions. One is about the demography. I would really be interested to see how many refugees were from which demography, where they were living independendly or under IOM accommodation, under IOM services. Also, how many refugees who were interviewed or collaborated in these projects, they were single male or single individuals, and how many of them were living with their families. I think that would be really helpful to understand and get the full picture of the issues that you discussed. And also, I would say that would be helpful if we could discuss the political implication of the refugee status and refugee issues. I think we cannot just plainly go and see what's happening in Indonesia now if we do not include Australia's refugee policies. Indonesian refugees living in Indonesia are directly impacted by Australia's anti-refugee policies. Many of these refugees who are living in Indonesia, they have relatives, they have families in Australia. So how Australian government is responsible for some of these issues and challenges that refugees are suffering today. I think the discussion would be really interesting to see how these policies have impacted lives of thousands of refugees, and why discrimination is there when Australia accepts refugees from all over the world, but do not accept refugees, as it's mentioned in the report, who came after 30th of June 2014. So, and then I would say we also received to collaborate for this report as an organization, but we chose not to participate because the funding came from the Australian government, and one of the criteria and the outcome of this funding, which states in the website, is that it should reflect the priorities of the Australian government. I would say we as an organization really care about the refugees, and we think it would be really good to, in the recommendation, to include advocacy for the increased resettlement of refugees in Australia, because and some of the like as you mentioned, resettlement and clarity in their future is one of the recommendation, and the resettlement is one of the demands. We don't talk about the 19 people committing suicide in Indonesia. We have seen this happen in Manus and Nauru. We don't discuss about these issues, and I think they're huge issues that is, I think, needs to be researched in future reports. I think, we need to be comprehensive and need to be inclusive as well, to include all those issues as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Great. Really important questions. And I think I might make a comment on that before I hand to Angela to answer some of those questions. Look, we certainly respect the point about the Australian government funding, and we certainly made some decisions around that and believed that we had some independence in what we could say in relation to the funding, but totally respected that some refugee-led organisations chose not to participate on that basis. We are continuing to and intend to continue publishing and making representations from the data, which can and should include the politics that you mentioned. And there certainly is, in my view, a very clear link between the pathways to uncertainty type issues that Angela was talking about and the Australian government's policies, which do create a level of structural injustice that Indonesian refugees face on a day-to-day basis. And it's certainly part of the intention for us to publish and advocate more on that through this research and invite others to partner with us on that. I might just go to Angela to talk to the demographic questions first, and then we might come back to the politics, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Angela?
absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. Thanks so much for those comments and questions, Var. I think it's really insightful and really helpful. And I think you can probably tell that the purpose of this study came from us seeing things that were happening that were really unjust and trying to figure out the best tools that we had to try to advocate for exactly the reasons that you spoke of. So thank you for making that comment. In terms of the demographics, we did have participants in the study who are both in IOM shelters and participants who are in independent housing. And we saw some interesting patterns around what the experience of refugees living in those different contexts were like. And it's probably things that you might be able to guess. So we saw that, for example, in independent housing, people felt that they had more freedom and ability to, to engage in their own activities. And that was a positive. But we saw people who are living in IOM shelters reported lower difficulties in terms of meeting basic needs and so on. So we saw this sort of complex picture there. We saw many of our participants were young men who had arrived in Indonesia alone. And as I mentioned before, half of our participants had no immediate family in Indonesia. And I think one of the really important findings from this research study was the incredibly strong impact of isolation and loneliness. Gulsha Kurt, who's on this call, who's a psychologist working with us at the Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program, has been working on some analyses around this, really highlighting how that's driving some of the mental health problems that we reported in this project. And I think that really relates to, obviously people being separated from their family, but also the policies that make it very difficult for people to be reunited with their families under these contexts.
Thank you, Angela. I wonder if, Angela, you could also talk to the other question that Muzaffar had. I think this relates to the fourth theme and some of the challenges around clarity of information from UNHCR and other actors in Indonesia in relation to the RSD. I mean, from my perspective, there was significant commentary from the participants about the frustration in the absence of information and the lack of clarity in information, which we know is largely driven and influenced by Australian politics. And some of those issues were also seen, I guess, in some of the issues around access to shelters. I know we were limited in how we specifically collected this data, but I wondered if you were able to comment on, why these things particularly were significant in their impact on mental health for refugees.
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw these concerns around protection and also interfacing with the RSD process being really, really salient. So a lot of people reported, as I mentioned, being fearful of being sent back to their home country, being fearful of having their visa status never resolved. We had a substantial number of people reporting conflict with immigration officials and feeling that lack of information and clarity was very, very important. And we heard this anecdotally, we heard this in the focus groups as well, people speaking about what that felt like to be, sitting in that environment. The average amount of time people in this study had been in Indonesia was 5 years, that's the average. We had people who'd been there much, much longer and waiting for this period of time with little certainty. As I mentioned before, this dovetails with what we know about how people respond to adversity, and that the importance of this predictability and this information, I don't think, can be overestimated. And it was certainly one of the most salient themes that came up from participants who took part in the study.
We certainly also did one or a couple of focus groups as part of the study as well, which this topic was a significant part of the discussion. And so I think there is scope for us to pursue this further. And at this stage, our objective is to let people know about the research, the content, and to invite further collaborations on these types of advocacy points. And I note the comments from Victoria about this in the chat as well, and certainly we're aware that they're significant. I also wanted to give Atika an opportunity to comment on this particular issue as well.
Yeah, thank you, David. Based on the Muzaffar said, that I agree with you, such as the policy of Australian policy, like closing border or even changing leadership between like a president or prime minister in Indonesia or Australia, that the policy can be changed. And about the increased resettlement to Australia, we also agree with that. And it is, but it is our limitation about that resettlement process is very close and exclusive. It is that is our challenges also to answer the question all of the refugee about the resettlement. And I think that is what must be encouraged transparency. Like Victoria said that about RSD, about resettlement, we need the transparency. We need the how that progress, and how that can impact of the refugee. And unfortunately, we have not yet found a specific form of the advocacy about that, but we voice our concern through about resettlement. Our concern through public events or mentioned in our statement. So it is indeed necessary to encourage the Indonesian government to also put pressure on other countries to solve and make open for the resettlement. And it is that is the yesterday that our Minister of Foreign Affairs said that specifically in the context, yeah, it is specifically on the context of Rohingya, but he said that urging the countries party to the Refugee Convention, especially developed countries, to open their doors wider to refugees through resettlement programs in their countries. We can also encourage this for others refugee. To talk about that to the others. It is political, but we can spread out our voices to that. Thank you, David.
Great. I might just move to a different question. I'm going to go back to Angela, if that's okay. Angela, in the study, one of the things that we looked at was the intersection of the relationship between environmental factors and psychological coping strategies. And I raise this because I think sometimes it can seem like addressing mental health in the context of refugee displacement can be overwhelming because there's so many different things going on. But I'm wondering if you could comment on the significance of that interaction between the environmental and the psychological, and how it might help people that are on the call that are involved with refugee communities to maybe think about practical steps that can be taken to support refugee wellbeing and coping on a day-to-day level.
Yeah, thanks, David. So in this study, we were interested in looking at a wide range of coping strategies to try to understand what could really be most effective in, I guess, really mitigating some of these mental health effects that we were seeing, recognizing this is happening in a broader context of just really challenging circumstances. What we found in the study was some of the things that we looked at, which we considered to be I guess, negative coping strategies, things that people were doing that weren't helpful. So these are things like pushing away any emotions that they might feel, or thinking over and over again about negative things that have happened in the past or the future. These things had a really powerful impact on mental health. People were more likely to do them when they were under conditions of high stress, and they had a stronger effect on mental health under conditions of high stress. In contrast, some of these other factors that were protective against mental health, these were things like coping, feeling like you were able to manage your environment around you, having hope for the future. These kinds of things did have a positive impact on particularly quality of life, but these things weren't as effective when people were under high stress situations. And so I think what we can take from here is a couple of take-home points. One, of course, always working towards trying to changing these structural factors that are affecting well-being, but also the finding to suggest that just because people are in stressful situations, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do to help people cope better. And there are a lot of really great quality evidence-based programs that can be delivered quite easily and quite efficiently, and can be delivered by refugee communities to others in refugee communities that can be effective in teaching coping skills. And I think what we were trying to do in this study was to try to move away from kind of a one-size-fits-all, and to understand under which circumstances, which strategies are most effective. And this actually led us to do a second study. This is a study that we're just finishing at the moment. After identifying what were some of the key drivers of refugee wellbeing and how different coping strategies were more and less effective in this environment, we saw that we had really good information and evidence, but we also saw there was a real lack of mental health services available. And so what we did in our next project, which was another research project, is we worked with refugee communities to train individuals within refugee communities in a brief mental health intervention. This was very brief. It was a workbook that people received, as well as 5 check-in phone calls that were provided by a community member. And what we really wanted to do there was see whether implementing these kind of strategies that we'd identified in the study could be helpful. And the results are preliminary. We're still finalizing at the moment, but it's looking really positive in the sense that even this quite low touch, low intensity intervention can be helpful in giving people a toolkit. And that's really how our participants who took part in this second study described it, is now I have more skills, I have more strategies, I have more options when stressful things are happening in my life that can help me maintain a sense of calm, maintain a sense of well-being despite the things that are going on around me. And so I think that sort of approach is something that's really practical and can be implemented, relatively easily by people working on the ground in the front line with people from refugee backgrounds to provide those skills despite being under really stressful circumstances.
Can I ask you a follow-up question, Angela? In the study, you mentioned, I believe, that social isolation was a big factor in contributing towards negative mental health, but we also identified that on the contrary, not all social support was good. And I'm wondering whether you could comment a bit on the findings around the types of social support that are beneficial versus not so.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we talk about social connection, often we only think about the good parts of that. That's things like feeling valued by other people, having someone to speak to, when you're feeling upset, having someone to lean on. But of course, when people are socially connected, there are other things that can happen. There can be conflict, there can be arguments, there can be demands placed on people, particularly when you're in a situation of high stress. What we found there was that these different kinds of social interactions were differentially associated with well-being. So we saw a stronger relationship, understandably, between that positive social support, feeling connected, feeling valued, feeling cared about. That was positively related to well-being. But we saw that was then when people who were very connected with others, but in a more negative way, were experiencing a lot of conflict and arguments and so on, that was associated with negative well-being. And I think that speaks to the importance of when we're looking at social programming and social inclusion, supporting communities to really be able to engage in those positive types of support for one another, while really removing some of these factors that I think are contributing to this stress, this kind of context where there's a lot of arguments, demands, and fights and so on.
Thank you. While I've got you, actually, there's one more question in the chat around whether we collected data for young people under the age of 19.
I'm sorry to say we didn't. I think that's an excellent idea. We know that the protection situation of refugee youth is absolutely at a critical point, and this is extremely important. This study was really limited to people 18 and over, but I think that's a wonderful future research direction. So thank you for the suggestion.
I'm just going to go to Hafsa. Hafsa, I'm interested if you could comment on how we can get issues like mental health and wellbeing of refugees in transit onto the national and international agenda more so, and also how we can ensure that that is linked to some of the state's externalization policies that do contribute towards people being stuck in these situations for long periods of time.
Yeah, that reminds me of the panel we spoke one day ago here. So we're talking about if we send 1.3 million people back to the country and then positioning them in the political decision making, and then the decision to make that will impact their life. How will that mean? I said, these people have been through so much, and we are not providing them any mental health support in the refugee camp. And if people are not mentally in the right space, healthy space, they are not in the position to make decision. That will then impact greatly to them, like repatriation, like policy decision, and all of that. So any countries that want the refugee and forcibly displaced population, whether to be able to go back to their country of origin and rebuild their community, or contribute to the society, they must contribute to this mental health support. Otherwise, these people will not be mentally in the right space to be able to contribute to build their own community, and as well as to integrate upon repatriation as well. So one other thing that we could advocate to the allies and all the state government is that the mental health support, because there was a lot of competing protection issue and challenges, people are so focusing on the urgency of the now, like, okay, how do we make sure these people are not deported and blah, blah, but people always think, and the state and government always think mental health issue are secondary and, not so important. But I think this finding will be sort of useful. And then for us, it will be important to constantly advocate is that it's not secondary. The damages that can cause to individual and then the community is severe to the extent that cause some death. Otherwise, this mental health impact will also carry through to the life wherever they go, upon resettlement, to their community and family, etc. That's all I can think of for now in the middle of the night. I hope that helped.
Thank you, Hafsa. I guess, one of the things we hoped from this research was that it would provide some tools to support advocacy and to support raising awareness about the mental well-being of refugees in these situations. But the data doesn't just focus on mental health prevalence, it focuses on the day-to-day stress factors, trying to paint a picture of what life is like for a refugee who doesn't have access to basic health services, who doesn't have access to legal protections, who doesn't have access to clear information about durable solutions, and being able to position particularly the refugees in Indonesia who are subject to falling into the gaps of some of the resettlement options. And certainly we know that advocacy is still ongoing in Australia to lift the bar on resettlement for refugees, of whom many people were part of this study. And so it's also worth noting that many of the participants had been living in Indonesia for 8 to 10 years and still were not clear about what their future would look like. So there's certainly a lot of work to be done with UNHCR and IOM in that local context, but as we've been saying, we'd like to see this being used to support raising awareness regionally. We are coming to the end, so I just want to give the panel participants an opportunity for one last word. I know there is a question in the chat about the role of technology and access to technology, which panel members may want to comment in their final comments. But I might start with Atika, if you just want to make some final remarks.
Yeah, Thank you, David. It is, oh, okay. I think that is the data in this research is very important as a reference for improving the healthcare system, especially mental health, and the policy or law in Indonesia to include refugee as a group that must also be taken into consideration. So I hope that the refugee will understand about the mental health. Like Hausar said before, it is not a taboo subject, and that is in an important part of our life. And it is also encourage the community to contribute and help the refugee. Please also be contact to SUAKA if you want to know about the context of refugee and the others speaker here. So thank you so much, David. Back to you, and thank you the others.
No problem. Let's go to Angela.
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone for your interest in being here today. I've been frantically noting down some of the suggestions in the chat. As David mentioned, I mentioned before, this research is really designed to be a tool that we can use for advocacy, but also to inform policy and practice moving forward. So please do feel free to reach out if you have any ideas or any suggestions. It really was a true honour to work on this project and to have had these experiences shared with us from refugee communities in Australia, and to continue moving forward with the following work that we've done in trying to improve mental health and access to mental health services for refugees in Indonesia. So, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the co-panelists for working on this together.
Thank you, Angela. And Hafsa, final word for you.
Thank you, Angela. Now I can clearly remember your name. Thanks, David. So I think this report is a very good tool for us to really challenge all the states in the region, challenge the harmful policy that actually put refugee into more vulnerable situation, and also demanding these resources and critical support for mental health, because mental health, from my opinion, is something that we can make a challenge that is challenging not only for refugee communities, also for the local communities. If there is a shared struggles, that could also be something, that as a common goal, we can advocate for all people living in Indonesia, all people, regardless of their status, living in India, etc. So one of the things that I'm also thinking is that this report is in a way fascinating to think that how it is actually mental can contribute to the wider ecosystem of refugee protection as equal pressing matter as other refugee protection issue, and ranging from the state and also to the wider policy level. So I think it will be interesting to see how we can further replicate this research to other region and also apply it in whatever we see it fits. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafsa. I just want to reiterate my thanks on behalf of host for the cooperation from the partners and particularly the participants in this study. And I really genuinely invite you to send us through feedback or suggestions for how we can use the data to advance awareness about these issues and to advance decisions around funding and programming, and also advocacy, importantly, on the regional responses and responsibilities around refugees. And so I really appreciate the conversation today and forward to further discussions on this. Keep an eye out for, we will be advertising some further sessions to go into some of the topics in a bit more detail, and we'll advertise them through the APRIN network. But thank you again for everyone's participation today, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Stay safe.
Bye. Bye.